Hey, happy Sunday, Truth Seekers. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me today. It was encouraging to see Jordan Peterson do his Bible series recently. When I first saw him, I remember in the comments so many people trying to surmise whether or not Peterson was a theist or an agnostic or maybe an atheist. And I'd go through the comments and just laugh hysterically because when I listened to him talk, I realized automatically this man is a Christian. He's teaching Christian principles. I mean, I talked about some of them that morning in Sunday school, but he's doing it under the guise of philosophy. It's just a really interesting phenomenon to me to see how people react to this. I mean, sure, Moses and Carl Jung didn't share the same doctrinal beliefs, but Peterson's audience has been programmed to believe one source is valid while the other is a pure work of fiction and fairy tale. The truth is, there's much to learn from those who altruistically documented, painstakingly recorded these principles over the periods of thousands of years, strictly because they knew others would benefit from them. I mean, it really is a miracle if you think about the preservation and the coherence of what we still have in terms of records. I personally believe there are lots that we don't have that would clarify a lot of what we do have, but I can save that for another day. Now, these pearls cannot even be cast before swine until they're first earned through diligence, study, and practice. In many cases, a full lifetime's worth. Now, I commend Dr. Peterson for his efforts, and I would like to follow his lead in an area where, let's be honest, I've got some great nuggets to share. So with any luck, I will, like Shapiro, Peterson, et al., do somewhat regular videos on topics that have tremendous value, but are all intentionally overlooked by the more enlightened secular portion of the populace. So if you enjoy them, please subscribe and please share. I'd appreciate it. So the question is, where do we start? Good question. Now, a little background. Some of the provisions of the Mosaic Law were sophisticated and exceptionally sound legal prescriptions. Now, most of us are familiar with the strict Jewish laws known as the Carnal Commandments, mentioned frequently as the 613 Commandments, which I may also cover another day. But recently I caught a glimpse of this article and I couldn't help myself. I just love my clickbait. So I checked it out. It says, "Sorry, America, you're wrong. The Jews did not kill Jesus." Now, as a point of pragmatism, I don't usually suggest listening to people about Jesus who don't follow him, nor do I entertain lectures about scripture by those who believe them to be fairy tales. So imagine my shock when the Daily Beast ginned up an article about who actually killed Jesus. Spoiler alert, if you don't have time to read it, the Jews got a bad rap. It was actually, ta-da, the Romans. This article is a steaming pile of crap. Not bad just because of what's in it, but like all fake news and in the fad, because of what's left out. So the first thing I had to do is go to Candida and find out a little bit more about this. Holy smoke, she's got some credentials. How about that? Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham. Frequent news commentator for CBS and CNN. Uh-oh. I'm just teasing. Christian scholar attacks trans people with ancient smear. Oh, no. Oh boy, the Pompeii man who've been a lonely masturbator. I can tell this woman is she is definitely a professor of theology, because that's something we all need to know more about. Needless to say, I've read through several of these articles. It makes a lot of sense why this woman is the Daily Beast and CNN religious commentator on Christianity and not me. That's all I'm going to say. I also love that the article opens up with a poll released by the Anti-Defamation League about who is responsible for the death of Jesus. Again, appealing to experts. This woman is essentially the Malcolm Nance of Christian theologists. Now, nowhere in this article, which you can read because I'll link to it in the description, but take my word for it, it definitely does not take into account the Jewish leadership had to break dozens of laws to put this man to death. When I say this man, I mean Christ. No less than 14 by my very cursory count. These are the same types of laws that the plebes were wont to break. They just didn't risk it. It was too much at stake. As Reza Aslan put it to me, the method of execution settles this question once and for all. Crucifixion was a strictly Roman punishment for crimes against the state. You went to Oxford and Yale, and the best you can do here, Candida, is name-dropping Reza Aslan? Blah, vomit. I get it. Coming up with new stuff to write about when you have a doctorate is hard. Pilate's impromptu cuticle soak from the Gospel of Matthew should also find itself on the cutting room floor. It is utterly implausible. Flash mobs of thousands of people do not miraculously assemble and offer complicated answers in unison without the assistance of smartphones. I just want to throw this in. This was the annual feast of the Passover in the capital city. Are you serious, Candida? The Jewish leaders were acting like organizers, whipping the people up into a frenzy. So Candida actually quotes the Pope. She says, even the Pope agrees. In Jesus of Nazareth, part 2, Benedict XVI says, quote, "How could the whole people have been present at that moment to clamor for Jesus' death?" Amen to that. Okay, I actually have an answer for that. Think about the last Black Lives Matter protest. the Million Man March, even just the recent anti-Antifa one we had the other day where someone got hit by a car and killed. This was an annual feast day in the capital city that had the annual tradition of releasing of a prisoner. Duh. Also, it says multiple times in the scriptures, Jesus' fame went throughout the land. Do you and the Pope really think people wouldn't have been up for the spectacle? Sorry. Now, next bullet. This is what makes this issue different. The view that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus does not only measure the prevalence of a historically important caricature, it measures a certain kind of biblical literacy. She doesn't help us at all here. She just leaves us hanging. She provides no biblical literacy at period, all, period. Hard stop. Next bullet. One finding of the ADL poll was that the higher a participant's education level, the less likely he or she was to hold anti-Semitic views or subscribe to negative views about Jews. The appeal to higher education is always fascinating to me. Does this education include Biblical Scholarship 101? I mean, she's trying to make this article about Semitism, whether they're anti or pro-Semite. It has nothing to do with that, in my opinion. It has to do with historical fact on the record and also doctrine, not just Christian, but Jewish doctrine. I'm going to go through the Jewish laws that they broke to make this happen. And then you can tell me how that measures in terms of biblical literacy, since you provided no examples of your own. Oh yeah, you're the professor. I'm just a regular guy in my bedroom. Now, reading the New Testament alone does not clear this up. Saying it wasn't all Jews does not satisfy. What's needed here is not just biblical literacy, but historical competency. Again, crickets. She offers none. So I would like to jump in where she was unwilling or able to. Laws broken by Jews to crucify Jesus Christ. Number one, it was unlawful to arrest him at night. As I will demonstrate, this and many other violations constituted the semblance of a trial. The purpose was to convict the prisoner in time to have him brought before the Roman authorities as early as possible in the morning. The laws that protect the rights of the citizens would not allow this to happen, so the law had to be suspended by those with a sworn oath and sacred duty to uphold it. This entire act was unlawful. Number two, testifying at night. From Gethsemane, the bound and captive Christ was held before the Jewish rulers. John alone informs us that the Lord was taken first before Annas, who sent him still bound to Caiaphas, the high priest, while as the other Gospels record only the arraignment before Caiaphas. No details of the interview with Annas are of record, and the bringing of Jesus before him at all was highly irregular and illegal, according to Hebrew law, as were all of the subsequent proceedings of that night. Annas, whose father-in-law was Caiaphas, had been deposed from the high priestly office over 20 years before, but was present throughout this ordeal. He had exerted a potent influence on all the affairs of the hierarchy. Caiaphas, as John is careful to remind us in verse 11, was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Verse 53 said that from that day forth they took counsel together to put him to death. My question is, was Caiaphas, when Caiaphas said one man should die for the people, was he referring to the public or for the leadership? Which people did he have in mind? Number three, legal hearings had to take place in the official courtroom of the Sanhedrin. In the palace of Caiaphas, the chief priests, scribes, and elders of the people were assembled. They were all eagerly awaiting the result of the expedition led by Jesus. When Jesus, the object of their bitter hatred and their predetermined victim, was brought in a bound prisoner, he was immediately put up on trial in contravention of the law, both written and traditional, of which those congregated rulers of the Jews professed to be such zealous supporters. No legal hearing on a capital charge could lawfully be held except in the appointed official courtroom of the Sanhedrin. Number four, Jesus not told what he was being charged with or protected from testifying against himself. This is a big one. From the account given in the fourth gospel, we infer that the prisoner was subjected first to an interrogated examination by the high priest in person. That functionary, whether Annas or Caiaphas is a matter of inference, inquired of Jesus concerning his disciples and his doctrines. Such a preliminary inquiry was utterly unlawful, for the Hebrew code provided that the accusing witness in any cause before the court should define their charge against the accused, and the latter should be protected from any effort to make him testify against himself. Hey, we have a rule like this. It's genius, right? The Lord's reply should have been a sufficient protest to the high priest against further illegal procedure. Jesus answered him, I speak openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why ask now me? Ask them which heard me. What I have said unto them, behold, they know what I said. This was a lawful objection against denying to a prisoner the right to be confronted by his accusers. It was received with open disdain, and one of the officers who stood by, hoping perhaps to curry favor with the leadership, struck Jesus across the face. And Jesus answered with almost superhuman gentleness, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if I well, why smitest thou me?" Combined with submissiveness, however, this constituted another appeal to the principles of justice. If what Jesus had said were evil, why did not the assailant accuse him? And if he had spoken well, what right does a police officer or judge have to condemn and punish, and that too in the presence of the high priest? Law and justice had been dethroned. Number 5, accusers required to appear in person. 2 concordant witnesses required, and they must be warned against perjury or false witness. In the Sanhedrin, every member was a judge. The judicial body was to hear the testimony, and according to that testimony and not else, render a decision on every case duly presented. The accusers were required to appear in person, and they were to receive a preliminary warning against bearing false witness. Every defendant was to be regarded and treated as innocent until convicted in due course. Again, does any of this legal precedent sound familiar to you as an American? But in the so-called trial of Jesus, the judges not only sought witnesses, but specifically tried to find false witnesses. Though many false witnesses came, if there was no, quote, witness or testimony against the prisoner, for this suborned perjurers failed to agree among themselves, and even the lawless Sanhedrin hesitated to openly violate the fundamental requirement that at least 2 concordant witnesses must testify against an accused person, for otherwise the case had to be dismissed. That Jesus was to be convicted on some charge or other and to be put to death had already been determined by the priestly judges. Their failure to find witnesses against him threatened to delay the carrying out of their nefarious scheme. This is evidenced by the next law that they broke. Number 6, unlawful for the council to consider such a charge on the Sabbath, a feast day, or the eve of any such day. This happened to occur at night on the eve of the final day of the Passover. Double whammy. Passover, big deal. Sabbath, huge deal. They should have known better, and they did know better. Number 7, witnesses were weak and the charges were soft. A nighttime farce trial was appropriate. While this wasn't exactly the breaking of a specific law, it's humorous to think a legitimate trial would have dignified what happened when the Sanhedrin put their circus ring of witnesses together. After struggling to find 2 hostile witnesses who would tell the same falsehood, at last, 2 did. They said, quote, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it again in 3 days," unquote. Others, however, testified, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." And so, as Mark observes, even this particular witness testimony did not agree. Surely in a case in front of the bar, such a discrepancy as appears between "I am able to" and "I will" as alleged utterances of the accused is of vital importance, is it not? Yet the semblance of formal accusation was the sole basis of a charge against Christ up to this stage of the trial. It will be remembered that in connection with the first clearing of the temple near the commencement of Christ's ministry, he had answered the clamorous demand of the Jews for a sign of his authority by saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He spoke not at all of himself as the one who would destroy the temple. The Jews were to be the destroyers, and Christ the restorer. The inspired writer of the scripture is particular to explain that Jesus spoke of the temple of his body, and not at all of those buildings reared by man, which prophecy was about to be fulfilled. These wicked servants professed to regard the holy house while wantonly profaning its precincts. The vaguely defined shadow of legal accusations produced by the dark and inconsistent testimony of the false witnesses was enough to embolden the iniquitous court. Caiaphas, rising from his seat to give dramatic emphasis to his question, demanded of Jesus, "Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses witness against thee?" There was nothing to answer. No consistent or valid testimony had been presented against him, so he stood in dignified silence. Number 8, Caiaphas demands Jesus to testify. Caiaphas, in violation of the legal prescription against requiring any person to testify in his own case, except voluntarily and on his own initiative, not only demanded an answer from the prisoner, but exercised the potent prerogative of the highly priest office to put the accused under oath as a witness before the sacerdotal court. And the high priest answered and said unto him, "I adjure thee by the living God, tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." The fact of a distinct specification of the Christ and the Son of God is significant. It implies the Jewish expectation of a Messiah, but does not acknowledge that he was to be distinctively of divine origin. Nothing that had gone before can be construed as a proper foundation for this inquiry. The charge of sedition was about to be superseded by one of greater enormity, that of blasphemy. Number 9, the high priest rending of his garments. To the unjust yet official adjuration of the high priest, Jesus answered, "Thou hast said, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." This expression, "thou hast said," was equivalent to, "I am what thou hast said." It was an unqualified avowal of divine parentage and inherent godship. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" Interesting. "Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye?" They answered and said, "He is guilty of death." The action of the high priest in rending his garments was a dramatic affectation of pious horror at the blasphemy with which his ears have been assailed. It was expressly forbidden in the law that the high priest rent his clothes. From extra scriptural writings, we learn that the rending of garments was as an attestation of most grievous guilt, such as that of blasphemy, was allowable under traditional rule. There is no indication, however, that the vote of the judges was taken and recorded in the precise and orderly manner required by law. So I'll put a question mark next to that one. Number 10, capital convictions were not allowed by confession unless supported by the testimony of trustworthy witnesses. As in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus had voluntarily surrendered himself. So before the judges did he personally and involuntarily furnish the evidence upon which the unrighteous declared him deserving of death. Number 11, as I alluded to earlier, vote taken and recorded. There is no indication that the vote of the judges was taken and recorded in the precise and orderly manner required by law. Now, why would that be, I wonder? Why wouldn't any of these esteemed and noble priests want their signatures on this deed? Number 12, blasphemy in reverse. Blasphemy was one of the most heinous crimes you could commit. I just want to make that very clear. They heaped on every indignity their brutish instincts could suggest. They spurted foul spittle into his face, and having blindfolded him, amused themselves by smiting him again and again, saying the whole while, "Prophesy unto us, Christ, who is he that smote thee? Who is he that hit thee?" The miscreant crowd mocked him and railed upon him with jeers and taunts and branded themselves blasphemers. In fact, it was indeed a heinous crime. Number 13, the second day trial for capital charges. Now, this is interesting. I rarely hear this talked about. The law and the practice of the time required that any person found guilty of a capital offense after the trial before the Jewish tribunal should be given a second trial on the following day. At this later hearing, any or all of the judges who had before voted for conviction could reverse themselves, but no one who had once voted for acquittal could change his ballot. A bare majority was sufficient for acquittal, while more than a majority was required for conviction. Now, apparently, for the purpose of establishing a shadowy pretext of legality in this procedure, the Sanhedrin adjourned to meet again in early daylight. Thus, they technically complied with the requirement, but they completely ignored the equally mandatory provision that the second trial must be conducted on a day following that of the first hearing. Between the two sittings on consecutive days, the judges were required to fast and pray and to give the case on trial calm and earnest consideration. No dice. Number 14, unanimity results in a mistrial. This is fascinating. This has to be one of my absolute favorites. By a provision that must appear to us most unusual, if all the judges voted for conviction on a capital charge, the verdict was not to stand, and the accused had to be set at liberty. For, it was argued, a unanimous vote against a prisoner indicated that he had no friend or defender in court, and that the judges might have been in conspiracy against him. Under this rule in Hebrew jurisprudence, the verdict against Jesus rendered at the illegal night session of the Sanhedrin was void. Now, every time I watch Dateline and some Yahoo juror lets a murderer go free, I think about the wisdom of this law. Getting a unanimous verdict is incredibly difficult, and you can argue conspiracy is just as likely a factor in unanimity as not. We are specifically told that they all condemned him to be guilty of death. Now, I'm going to call this one 14b. Early on Friday morning, the, quote, whole council, that is to say, of the Sanhedrin, led Jesus bound to the judgment hall of Pontius Pilate. But with strict scrupulosity, they refrained from entering the hall lest they become defiled. For the judgment chamber was part of a house of a Gentile, not a Jew. And somewhere therein might be leavened bread, even to be near which would render them ceremonially unclean. Now let everyone who can hear my voice designate for themselves the character of men afraid of the mere proximity of leaven while thirsting for innocent blood. 14c. At this point, we focus on the question ostensibly answered by Professor Candida Moss. As the Sanhedrin delivered their prisoner to Pilate, he asked, "What accusation bringest thou against this man?" The question, though strictly proper and judicially necessary, surprised and disappointed the priestly rulers, who evidently had expected the governor would simply approve their verdict as a matter of form and give sentence accordingly. But instead of doing this, Pilate was apparently about to exercise his authority of original jurisdiction. With poorly concealed chagrin, their spokesman, probably Caiaphas, answered, "If he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up to thee." Now it's likely that Pilate either took his turn in fading umbrage or that he might have granted the license they ostensibly sought. The Hebrew death sentence for blasphemy would have been stoning. As Reza Aslan astutely mentioned, Jews never practiced crucifixion. Seemingly unaware of the prophecies from the great prophets such as Moses and Isaiah regarding the predicted manner of death of the Messiah, the Jews said, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." These evil, subversive men needed the Romans to provide the execution order and the executioners. The Sanhedrin therefore began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar," saying that he himself was Christ, a king. It is important to note that no accusation of blasphemy was ever mentioned to Pilate. This governor, thoroughly pagan at heart and mind, would have dismissed the charge as utterly unworthy of hearing. The Romans, with their many gods whose number was being steadily increased by current heathen deification of mortals, knew no such offense as blasphemy in the Jewish sense. The accusing Sanhedrin hesitated for not a second to substitute for blasphemy, which was the greatest crime known to the Hebrew code, the charge of high treason, which was the gravest offense listed in the Roman category of crimes. Very sneaky. Now this is important, given the context of the Daily Beast article. Pilate, after having an interesting conversation with Christ, told the Jews, quote, "I find no fault in him at all." But the chief priests and scribes and elders of the people were undeterred. Their thirst for the blood of the Holy One had developed into social justice warrior mania. And what do social justice warriors do? They did exactly what these individuals did. Wildly and fiercely they shrieked, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." It says right there in the scriptures why so many people were interested in this. They were being riled up. They were being community organized. Derp. Pilate, discovering that Christ was a Galilean, decided to send Jesus to the vassal ruler of that province with whom he'd previously been at enmity. Pilate would be rid of this inconvenience while perhaps placating Herod. It's a good political move. So Pilate sends Christ to Herod. Herod Antipas was the degenerate son of his infamous sire, Herod the Great, the same man who was tricked by a woman's voluptuous blandishment and separated John the Baptist from his head at her request, to satisfy her mother who had been condemned by John for committing adultery. We all know how social justice warriors and cheating wives feel about people who are, quote, judgmental. John was fairly judgmental. Now, two interesting things about Herod. Number one, he's the only person on record that the Lord is known to have applied an epithet of contempt. Quote, "Go ye and tell that fox." It's not the F word, but it is an F word. Number two, Herod, as far as we know, is the only person to be in the presence of Jesus and not hear him speak. Christ would not make a sound in his presence. Herod treated him malignantly, but sent him back to Pilate, finding nothing to warrant condemnation. Pilate understood, as written in Matthew and Mark, that the chief priests were suffering from envy, and that the claim of sedition was specious, if not totally ridiculous. Pilate thought to pacify the priests and people by releasing Jesus as the subject of Passover leniency. This would be a tacit recognition of Christ's conviction before the ecclesiastical court, and practically an endorsement of a death sentence superseded by official pardon. Pilate asked multiple times to the frenzied crowd who he should release, the convicted murderer or this man he felt was innocent. And each time he asked, there was another chance for the community organizers to frenzy up the populace. Then the chant started, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate asked the crowd, "What evil has he done?" It is important to note that Pilate's wife had sent him a warning message even as he sat on the judgment seat. She said, quote, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I've suffered many things this day in a dream because of him," unquote. Women's intuition. Those who know not God are characteristically superstitious, but Pilate had compromised himself by misusing his authority and being a leader of less than perfect integrity. Persisting in the effort to save this man's life may have been politically fatal to Pilate. So seeing that he could not prevail, lest because of tumult among the people he washed his hands before the multitude and said, I am innocent of the blood of this just man. See ye to it. At this point, the covenant people of Israel and Israel's God, Jehovah, screamed, His blood be upon us and upon our children. History books have demonstrated the fulfillment of these cries. Now, Roman torture was known as scourging. This frequently killed those who were meant to be crucified. Pilate had probably been a silent observer of this barbarous scene. He stopped it, and determined to make another attempt to touch the springs of Jewish pity, if such existed, he went outside and to the multitude said, Behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. This was the governor's third definite proclamation of the prisoner's innocence. Then Jesus came forth, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said unto them, Behold the man. Pilate seemed to have counted on the pitiful sight of the scourged and bleeding Christ to soften the hearts of the maddened Jews. But the effect failed. Think of the awful fact, a heathen, a pagan, who knew not God, pleading with the priests and people of Israel for the life of their Lord and King. Unmoved by the sight, the chief priests and officers cried with increasing vindictiveness, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate pronounced the fatal sentence, Take ye him and crucify him, but added with bitter emphasis, I find no fault in him. Sedition versus blasphemy. Jews extort a sentence from Pilate. It will be remembered sedition was the only charge preferred against Christ before the Roman governor. The Jewish persecutors had carefully avoided even the mention of blasphemy, which was the offense for which they had adjudged Jesus worthy of death. After that sentence of crucifixion had been extorted from Pilate, they brazenly attempted to make it appear that the governor's mandate was by ratification of their own decree of death. Therefore, they said, quote, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. But what did it mean? That all-inspiring title, Son of God, struck yet deeper into Pilate's troubled conscience. Once more he took Jesus into the judgment hall, and in trepidation asked, Whence art thou? The inquiry was as to whether Jesus was human or superhuman. A direct avowal of the Lord's divinity would have frightened but could not have enlightened the heathen ruler. Therefore Jesus gave no answer. Keep this in mind when an atheist asks you to present your evidence for what you believe. Pilate was further surprised and perhaps somewhat offended at the seeming disregard of his authority. He demanded an explanation, saying, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou that I have power to crucify thee, and have power to release thee? Then Jesus replied, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore, he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. The positions were reversed. Christ was now the judge, and Pilate the subject of his decision. Though not found guiltless, the Roman was pronounced less culpable than he or those who had forced Jesus into his power, and who had demanded of him an unrighteous committal. I guess what really bugs me about this article is this woman is an Oxford and Yale graduate. She's got a PhD. And what does she do with it? She uses this knowledge, I'm doing air quotes here, and influence and platform to apparently distort Bible truths and then write a book ripping on Hobby Lobby? I'll probably do another video on Esau selling his birthright for pottage. I mean, that's what this is. When we talk about privilege and potential and what's possible when you have all these tools at your disposal and what you do with them, it makes me think of the Sanhedrin. They were the learned, the anointed, the elite, and they used their privilege to secure comfort for themselves and peddle influence. Like Candida, they should have known better.